Flathead Lake stretches like a sapphire mirror across northwest Montana, nestled between the Mission Mountains and the Salish Range. Its waters run impossibly clear and cold, even in the height of summer. Growing up, this place was magic to me, a world away from our normal lives in Seattle, where Dad worked as an architectural engineer and Mom taught elementary school. The lake house wasn't grand or luxurious. It was a sturdy, two-story cabin with weathered cedar siding that Dad had built himself over 3 consecutive summers before I was born. The wraparound porch faced the water, adorned with mismatched rocking chairs and potted geraniums that bloomed rebelliously red against the blue backdrop of the lake. Inside, knotty pine covered every wall, and the stone fireplace dominated the main room. It smelled of wood smoke, old books, and the lingering ghost of Mom's apple pies. Dad bought the property when he was barely 30, long before lake property prices skyrocketed. "Best decision I ever made," he'd often say, "besides marrying your mother." I was the youngest of 2, born 4 years after Thomas. My earliest memories are framed by this place, learning to swim in the shallows, while Dad stood chest-deep in the water, arms outstretched, Thomas teaching me to skip stones on calm mornings, Mom reading to us on rainy afternoons while thunder rumbled over the mountains. When Mom died, I was 15, Thomas 19, the lake house became even more sacred. It was where we scattered her ashes, where Dad found moments of peace in his grief. While Thomas escaped to college and, rarely returned, I made the 6-hour drive from Seattle whenever I could, especially after I started my career as an environmental scientist. The lake became my research subject, my solace, my second home. "You've got your mother's heart, Joanne," Dad would say during our quiet dinners on the porch. "You see the soul in things." As Dad aged, I was the one who helped winterize the place, who drove him up for long weekends, who made sure he could still enjoy his sanctuary even as arthritis gnarled his once strong hands. Thomas visited at Christmas sometimes, bringing Vanessa after they married 7 years ago, but they always seemed impatient to leave, checking emails on their phones, complaining about spotty cell service. "City folks," Dad would say with a wink after they'd go, though Thomas had grown up in the same house as me. When Dad was diagnosed with congestive heart failure at 78, I took a leave of absence from my research position and moved him to Seattle. For 18 months, I coordinated his care, managed his medications, and brought him to the lake whenever his strength allowed. Thomas visited the hospital twice. "Don't be hard on your brother," Dad told me during one of our last lucid conversations. "He's built a different life, but you and I, Joe, we understand what matters." A week before he died, Dad asked me to take him to the lake house one final time. Against medical advice, I drove him up, installed an oxygen concentrator, and helped him shuffle out to the porch swing. We sat there for hours, watching the light change on the water. "This place is yours, Joe," he said, his voice thin but certain. "It always has been, in the ways that matter." I assumed he meant spiritually, metaphorically. The will had been drawn up years ago, and I knew the lake house was divided between Thomas and me, a decision Dad had made when Mom died, when we were both still young and he couldn't have known how our lives would diverge. I didn't press him on. It seemed selfish to discuss inheritance while he was still alive. The morning after we returned to Seattle, Dad suffered a massive stroke. He never regained consciousness. We held the funeral at his favorite church, where Thomas delivered a polished eulogy that somehow failed to capture anything essential about our father. Afterward, we met with Dad's attorney, a kind older man named Howard, who had been Dad's friend since college. "The will is straightforward," Howard explained. "The financial assets are to be divided equally. The Seattle house is to be sold, with proceeds split between you. The lake property goes to Joanne." Thomas's face darkened. "That can't be right. Dad always said we'd share that." Howard adjusted his glasses. "Arthur was quite clear about this, Thomas. The lake house goes solely to Joanne." Vanessa placed a manicured hand on Thomas's arm. "We'll need to see documentation of when this change was made," she said smoothly. "Thomas and I have already been planning our summers there. We've discussed renovations." My heart sank. Renovations? The house was perfect as it was. Every weathered board, every creaky floorboard held memories. Howard shuffled through some papers. "There's no change to review. This was Arthur's directive from the beginning." That night, Thomas called me, not to mourn together or share memories, but to stake his claim. "I'm not accepting this, Joe. Dad wasn't thinking clearly near the end. We both know that. He knew exactly what he was doing, Tom. He loved that place, and he knew I'd preserve it the way he wanted. It's worth over $2 million now. You can't honestly think he meant to cut me out completely. The conversation ended with Thomas threatening legal action. I was too exhausted by grief to fight. 3 months passed. Spring turned to summer. I hadn't been back to the lake house. It felt wrong somehow, like I'd be rubbing salt in Thomas's wound. Instead, I threw myself into work, into creating a routine that didn't include weekly calls to Dad's nurses or doctors. Then came the weekend that changed everything. I decided it was time to return to the lake, to begin healing. I packed my old Subaru with groceries, gardening tools, and a stack of Dad's favorite books. The 6-hour drive felt like coming home, but when I rounded the final curve in the gravel road, my heart stopped. Thomas's sleek black BMW was parked in the driveway, and on the porch, lounging in Dad's old rocking chair, sat Vanessa, phone in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her head. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as Thomas emerged from the house, beer in hand. This wasn't a casual visit. The way they'd positioned themselves, the way they'd taken over, told me everything I needed to know. The battle for my father's legacy had begun. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching Thomas and Vanessa on the porch. They hadn't noticed me yet. Vanessa was taking selfies with the lake in the background, while Thomas sprawled in Dad's chair, feet propped on the railing. My chest tightened. How dare they make themselves so comfortable? How dare they invade this sacred space without even asking? Finally, I turned off the engine and stepped out. The familiar scent of pine and lake water washed over me, but it couldn't calm the storm brewing inside. "Joe!" Thomas called out, raising his beer in greeting as if this were perfectly normal. "Was wondering when you'd show up." I forced myself up the gravel path, my grocery bag suddenly feeling like lead weights. "I didn't know you were coming this weekend," I said, aiming for neutral despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Vanessa stood, smoothing her expensive linen pants. "Surprise!" She attempted a hug that I stiffly returned. "We thought it would be good to spend some time here. You know, start making some new memories." I stepped past them into the house and froze. The interior had been rearranged. Dad's old leather armchair was gone, replaced by a sleek gray love seat I'd never seen before. The bookshelves had been cleared of his beloved fishing guides and nature books. Now they displayed Vanessa's collection of art glass and several framed photos of her and Thomas. "Where's Dad's chair?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. Thomas appeared behind me. "Storage room. That old thing was falling apart, Joe, and honestly, it smelled like mothballs. It was Dad's favorite." I set down my bags, my hands shaking slightly. "We can't keep this place like a museum," Vanessa chimed in, opening the refrigerator to reveal bottles of champagne and gourmet cheeses. "It needs updating. Thomas and I were thinking of knocking down this wall to open up the space." She gestured toward the wall that separated the kitchen from the dining area, the wall where Dad had marked our heights every summer of our childhood. "You can't do that," I said, my voice hardening. "This house isn't yours to renovate." Thomas crossed his arms. "It's half mine, Joe. The will might say otherwise, but we both know Dad would have wanted us to share it. That's not what his will says." I turned to face him directly. "And that's not what he told me before he died. He was confused, on medication." "He was perfectly lucid," I countered, "and he made his wishes clear. This place is mine, Thomas." Vanessa laughed, a tinkling sound that scraped against my raw emotions. "Oh, sweetie, we've already spoken to our attorney. Given that your father made this decision when his health was failing, and considering family property precedents in Montana, we have a very strong case for an equitable division." "You've spoken to an attorney? Already?" The betrayal cut deep. Dad wasn't even cold in his grave. Thomas at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It's just business, Joe. Nothing personal." "Nothing personal?" I echoed, incredulous. "This is our father's home, the place he built with his own hands, the place where we scattered." "Mom's ashes! How is that not personal?" Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Look, we're not trying to take it from you. We just want our fair share. Maybe we could work out a schedule. We get summers. You get the off-season." The audacity stunned me into silence. They wanted summers? The only time when the lake was warm enough for swimming, when the farmers' markets overflowed with fresh produce, when the sunset lingered until nearly 10 o'clock? "I need some air," I managed, turning toward the back door that led to the garden and the lake path beyond. "Don't be like that, Joe," Thomas called after me. "We're family. We can figure this out." I walked through Dad's carefully tended garden, past the rose bushes he'd planted for Mom, down to the small dock where his fishing boat still bobbed gently in. The water. Tears blurred my vision as I sank onto the weathered planks, trailing my fingers in the cold, clear lake. This was wrong. All of it. Not just their legal threats, but the way they'd invaded, rearranged, discarded. As if Dad's presence could be so easily erased. I don't know how long I sat there, watching the light change on the water, listening to the gentle lap of waves against the shore. The peace of the lake worked its magic gradually, soothing my anger and helping me think clearly. I couldn't fight them with rage or righteous indignation. I needed to be smarter, calmer, more strategic, like Dad would have been. When I returned to the house, Thomas and Vanessa had set up an elaborate charcuterie board on the porch table. An expensive bottle of red wine was breathing beside. Crystal glasses that certainly hadn't come from Dad's modest collection. "There she is," Thomas said, pouring wine as if we were at one of his corporate dinner parties. "Feel better?" I nodded, accepting the glass. "I'm sorry for overreacting. It's just, being back here brings up a lot." Vanessa shot Thomas a triumphant look. "We understand. Change is hard for everyone." I took a sip of wine, forcing myself to smile. "So, tell me about these renovation plans." For the next hour, I listened as they outlined their vision for modernizing the lake house. Granite countertops to replace Dad's beloved butcher block, tearing out the pine paneling for sheetrock and a more contemporary color palette, a hot tub on the deck, converting the boat shed into a wellness cabana for Vanessa's yoga. Practice. Each suggestion was a dagger, but I nodded and asked questions, playing for time. "And of course," Vanessa said, warming to her subject, "we'd want to update all the furniture. These old pieces are so rustic." "Dad made most of this furniture himself," I said quietly. Thomas waved dismissively. "And it was fine for its time, but we want to make this place Instagram-worthy, you know? Vanessa has a significant social media following, and this could be a fabulous backdrop for her lifestyle content." I nearly choked on my wine. Lifestyle content? This is a family home, not a set for influencer photos. "It can be both," Vanessa insisted. "I'm thinking of starting a lake life series. It would be amazing for my brand partnerships." As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the porch, Thomas finally got to the point. "So here's what we're proposing," he said, refilling his glass. "We drop the legal challenge if you agree to sign over half ownership. We split maintenance costs, property taxes, all that, and we work out a fair usage schedule." "What's fair in your mind?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Well, we'd take prime season, June through August. You can have spring and fall. We'll both share it during holidays or alternate years. And the renovations? We'd consult with you," Vanessa said unconvincingly. "But since we'd be putting in most of the capital for upgrades, we'd have final say on design decisions." I set down my glass and looked out at the lake, now painted with the fiery colors of sunset. Dad's voice seemed to whisper in the gentle evening breeze, "This place is yours, Joe. It always has been." "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Where are you staying tonight?" Thomas grinned. "Here, of course. We've taken the master bedroom. Hope that's okay." It wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. But I merely nodded, excused myself, and retreated to my childhood bedroom, now the only space in the house that remained untouched by their presence. As I lay in bed that night, listening to them laughing downstairs, I made a decision. I wouldn't sign anything. I wouldn't agree to their terms. I would find a way to honor Dad's wishes and protect his legacy. Little did I know that the answer was already waiting for me, hidden in the very heart of the home they were so eager to transform. Morning arrived with the gentle chorus of birdsong and the distant call of loons across the water. For a moment, wrapped in the familiar quilt of my childhood bed, I could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that Dad was downstairs brewing coffee, that the lake house remained the sanctuary it had always been. Then I heard Vanessa's voice, shrill and demanding, followed by Thomas's placating response. Reality crashed back. I dressed quickly and slipped out through the side door, avoiding the kitchen where they were no doubt planning more improvements to Dad's carefully crafted home. The garden path led me down to the shore, where dew still sparkled on the tall grasses and mist hovered over the lake's surface. This early hour had always been my favorite, when the water mirrored the sky so perfectly that the boundary between them disappeared. Dad and I used to sit here in companionable silence, fishing rods propped against the dock, waiting for the rainbow trout to bite. Patience, he'd say, is the most undervalued virtue of our time. I needed that patience now. Rushing headlong into a confrontation with Thomas and Vanessa would only strengthen their resolve. I needed to think like Dad, strategic, measured, deliberate. When I finally returned to the house, Vanessa was sprawled on a new lounge chair on the deck, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses as she scrolled through her phone. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Morning," I said, forcing politeness into my voice. "Where's Tom?" Vanessa lowered her phone. "Conference call. Some crisis at work." She gestured vaguely. "Toward the boathouse. The reception's better down there." Perfect. This might be my only chance to search for anything Dad might have left behind. Any clue that could strengthen my position. "I'm going to make some coffee. Want some?" I offered. She wrinkled her nose. "I brought my own cold brew. It's in the fridge. Organic, single-origin Ethiopian." Of course it was. In the kitchen, I moved methodically, scanning for anything out of place. The coffee tin where Dad kept spare keys was still on top of the refrigerator. His worn fishing hat still hung on the peg by the back door. But something felt off, something beyond the obvious intrusion of Thomas and Vanessa's presence. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I noticed that the drawer beneath the old roll-top desk was slightly ajar. Dad's desk, where he paid bills, wrote letters, and kept important documents. My heart quickened as I crossed the room and carefully opened the drawer wider. Inside was a chaotic jumble: fishing licenses, old birthday cards, instruction manuals for appliances long since replaced. But the worn leather folder where Dad had always kept property documents was missing. My coffee forgotten, I began a more thorough search, careful to leave everything as I found it. The file cabinet in Dad's bedroom, now occupied by Thomas and Vanessa's designer luggage, yielded nothing unusual. The hall closet where holiday decorations were stored seemed untouched. Finally, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a space that had always been half storage room, half Dad's workshop. The familiar scent of sawdust and old books enveloped me as I reached the top of the stairs. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight streaming through the small dormer windows. Dad's workbench stood against one wall, his tools hanging in their precise arrangement on the pegboard above. The opposite side held boxes of Christmas ornaments, camping gear, and Mom's old art supplies. In the corner sat Dad's trunk, a battered old steamer trunk that had belonged to his father before him. I'd always loved its brass fittings and the faint smell of cedar that emanated from it. Dad kept family heirlooms inside: Mom's wedding dress, his father's pocket watch, photo albums too precious for the living room shelves. I knelt beside it, running my fingers over the worn leather straps. To my surprise, it wasn't locked as it usually was. The brass hasp opened easily under my touch. Inside, nestled among the expected treasures, was a sealed manila envelope with my name written on it in Dad's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled as I lifted it out. The envelope contained several papers. The first was a handwritten letter, dated just 2 weeks before Dad died. "My dearest Joanne, if you're reading this, I've left this world behind, but I hope I've left you with good memories and a few useful lessons. One of those lessons is that sometimes you have to put things in writing to make them stick. I've always told you that the lake house was yours in spirit. Now I'm making it official. Enclosed is a codicil to my will, properly witnessed and notarized, that leaves the Flathead property solely to you. I've also included the original deed and purchase documents, which you may need." I didn't tell Thomas about this change. Maybe that was cowardly of me, but I know my son. He sees the lake house as a financial asset, not as the heart and soul that it is. You understand what this place means, not just to our family history, but to the land itself, to the water, to the whole ecosystem we've been privileged to be part of. Take care of it, Joe, and let it take care of you, as it has me all these years. All my love. Dad tears blurred my vision as I read the codicil, a formal legal document leaving the lake house property in its entirety to my daughter, Joanne Elizabeth Ramsey. It was signed by Dad, by Howard as witness, and by a notary public. The date was clear, just 10 days before Dad's death, when his mind was still sharp despite his failing body. I carefully returned everything to the envelope, then tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket. Whatever legal maneuvering Thomas and Vanessa were planning, this would stop it cold. As I closed the trunk, a floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around to find Thomas standing at the top of the attic stairs, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" "Up here?" he asked, voice flat. I gestured around the attic, just remembering. This was always Dad's space. Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Find anything interesting? My heart hammered against my ribs. Had he seen me with the envelope? Just old Christmas decorations, Mom's paintings, the usual. He crossed to Dad's workbench, running his fingers over the worn wood. I was thinking we could convert this space into a home office, put in some skylights, better insulation. It's wasted as storage. Anger flashed through me, but I tamped it down. You'd need to clear all this out first, I said neutrally. Already planning to. Vanessa's got a junk removal service coming next week. He picked up one of Dad's hand planes, testing its weight. Some of this old stuff might fetch a decent price on eBay. Vintage tools are trendy now. Dad's tools aren't junk, I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. And they're not yours to sell. Thomas set the plane down with a thud. We've been through this, Joe. Half of everything here is mine. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. Maybe we should wait until we've spoken to the lawyers before making any changes, I suggested, trying to sound reasonable. Our lawyer says possession is 9/10 of the law. Thomas smiled thinly. And we're here now, making improvements that will only increase the property value. That benefits us both. This isn't about property value, I said, my patience fraying. It's about respecting Dad's wishes, respecting his memory. Dad's gone, Joe. Thomas's voice hardened. And honestly, I think you're hiding behind his wishes because you want to keep this place all to yourself. He gestured around the attic. You had him all to yourself those last years. You don't get to hoard his memory, too. The accusation stung because it was so blatantly unfair. I didn't have him all to myself. I took care of him when he was dying. Where were you, Thomas? 2 visits in 18 months? I have a career, a life in Denver. I couldn't just drop everything. I did, I interrupted. I put my research on hold. I moved back to Seattle. I was there every day watching him fade away while you were too busy to even call regularly. Thomas's face flushed. That's not fair. None of this is fair, I said, suddenly exhausted. But this isn't about fairness. It's about what Dad wanted. And he wanted this place preserved, not turned into some Instagram backdrop for your wife's brand partnerships. I moved toward the stairs, needing to escape before I said something I'd truly regret. Thomas caught my arm as I passed. This isn't over, Joe, he said quietly. Vanessa and I have plans for this place. Big plans. You can either get on board or you can. Fight us and lose. I pulled away from his grip. We'll see about that. Downstairs, Vanessa was in the kitchen unpacking grocery bags filled with expensive organic produce and bottles of imported sparkling water. She glanced up as I entered. There you are. Thomas and I are hosting a little dinner party tonight. Just a few friends from Kalispell who are dying to see the place. She beamed as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Hope you don't mind. I minded very much, but with the envelope safely hidden in my jacket, I could afford to be gracious. Actually, I think I'll head into town for a while. Give you two some space. Vanessa looked relieved. Perfect! We'll probably be up late, so don't rush back on our account. I grabbed my car keys and headed out. The weight of Dad's letter a comforting presence against my heart. Thomas and Vanessa might think they had the upper hand, but the tide was about to turn. I just needed to figure out how to play this right. The drive into Big Fork took 20 minutes along winding lakeside roads. The small town sat at the northeast corner of Flathead Lake, its main street lined with art galleries, cafes, and outdoor outfitters, catering to the summer tourist crowd. I parked near the public library, a modest brick building where Dad and I had spent many rainy afternoons browsing through field guides and historical accounts of the region. Inside, I found a quiet corner with my laptop and the envelope. First, I photographed every document, uploading the images to my secure cloud storage. Then I called Howard, Dad's attorney, and friend. Joanne, he answered warmly. How are you holding up? I'm at the lake house, I said quietly, aware of other patrons nearby. And I'm not alone. Thomas and Vanessa are here, claiming partial ownership and planning renovations. Howard sighed heavily. I was afraid this might happen. Your brother was quite upset after the reading of the will. I found something in Dad's trunk. I continued. A codicil leaving the lake house solely to me. It has your signature as witness. The single syllable carried volumes. Arthur asked me to keep that confidential unless it became necessary. He hoped Thomas would respect his wishes without legal enforcement. Well, that's not happening, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. They've already rearranged furniture. They're planning major renovations, and Vanessa's talking about using the place for her social media brand. Send me the images, Howard instructed. I'll file the codicil with the court immediately. In the meantime, don't sign anything they put in front of you. Don't agree to any changes, verbally or in writing. After ending the call, I sat back, staring through the library's large windows at the mountains reflected in the lake beyond. I'd sent the documents, but legal proceedings would take time. Meanwhile, Thomas and Vanessa were in my house, Dad's house, treating it like their personal renovation project. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Where are you? Vanessa's friend's arriving in an hour. Bring more ice if you're coming back." I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and began researching Montana property law, adverse possession, and cohabitation rights. If Thomas and Vanessa were establishing residence, even temporarily, it could complicate things. 3 hours later, armed with legal information and a strategy, I drove back to the lake house. The driveway was filled with unfamiliar cars, luxury SUVs, and a couple of sports cars that looked ridiculously out of place against the rustic backdrop. Music drifted from the open windows, along with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. I parked on the road and walked up, steeling myself. Through the windows, I could see at least a dozen people in the main room. Someone had pushed all the furniture to the walls to create a makeshift dance floor. Vanessa was holding court near the fireplace, gesturing expansively as she spoke. Thomas stood nearby, looking slightly uncomfortable but trying to play the gracious host. I slipped in through the side door, hoping to reach my bedroom unnoticed. No such luck. "Joe!" Thomas spotted me immediately. "Come meet everyone!" Reluctantly, I joined the group by the fireplace. Vanessa performed rapid-fire introductions. A real estate developer, an interior designer, a couple who owned a chain of high-end boutiques in Montana and Idaho. These weren't casual friends. They were potential collaborators in whatever scheme Thomas and Vanessa were hatching. "Your brother has been telling us about the amazing potential of this property," the real estate developer said, eyeing me over his whiskey glass. "Lakefront parcels like this are gold mines if developed properly." I forced a smile. "It's not for development. It's a family home. Everything has development potential," he countered smoothly. "Even historic properties. The trick is balancing character with marketability." Vanessa jumped in before I could respond. "We're thinking of keeping the main house as our personal retreat, but there's room for 3, maybe 4 luxury cabins along the shoreline. High-end vacation rentals with incredible lake access." The blood drained from my face. "Vacation rentals? You want to subdivide the property?" Thomas at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "It's just an idea we're exploring, Joe. The rental income would more than cover maintenance costs." "This is conservation land," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Dad put most of the property into a conservation easement 20 years ago to prevent exactly this kind of development." The real estate developer's interest visibly dimmed. "Is that true, Thomas?" Thomas glared at me. "The easement only covers the back acreage, not the lakefront, and easements can be modified." "Not without significant legal hurdles," I countered. "The Montana Land Reliance holds the easement in perpetuity." An awkward silence fell over the group. Vanessa quickly steered the conversation to safer topics, but the damage was done. I excused myself and retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking with anger as I called Howard again, leaving a detailed voicemail about the development plans. This was worse than I'd imagined. They didn't just want to modernize the house. They wanted to carve up the land itself, to destroy the very peace and privacy that made this place special. The party continued late into the night. I lay awake, listening to strangers tramping through Dad's home, imagining their greedy eyes assessing its potential. When the last car finally left around 2 in the morning, I heard Thomas and Vanessa arguing in the kitchen, their voices too low to make out the words, but the tension unmistakable. Good. Let them fight. Let them feel the first cracks in their perfect plan. The next morning, I rose early again, this time finding Thomas alone on the dock, nursing a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a substantial hangover. He glanced up as I approached, then looked quickly away. "Quite a party," I said, sitting beside him. He grunted. "Vanessa got carried away with the guest list. And with the development plans?" I kept my voice neutral, curious to see if he'd be honest. Thomas sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not what you think, Joe." "No? Because it sounds like you're planning to turn Dad's sanctuary into a commercial resort." It's about financial viability, he said defensively. This place costs a fortune to maintain. Property taxes alone are over $20,000 a year. The rental income would ensure we could keep it in the family. By destroying everything that makes it special? I asked quietly. By putting strangers in cabins all over the property? By having people traipse across the land Dad specifically protected? Thomas stared out at the water. You always were the idealist. And you always were practical to a fault, I countered. But this isn't just about different values, Thomas. This is about Dad's explicit wishes. He put that land in conservation because he believed in protecting it, not exploiting it. He also believed in adapting to changing circumstances, Thomas said, but there was less conviction in his voice. I saw my opening. Did he tell you that? During one of your rare visits? Or did you decide that's what he would have wanted because it's convenient for your plans? Thomas flinched. That's not fair. None of this is fair. I echoed our conversation from the day before. But at least I'm trying to honor what Dad actually wanted, not what I wish he wanted. We sat in tense silence for several minutes, watching an osprey circle over the lake, then dive, suddenly into the water, emerging with a fish clutched in its talons. Dad loved watching them hunt, I said softly. Remember how he'd call us out to the porch whenever he spotted one? Thomas nodded, a rare, genuine smile softening his features. He kept a log of every osprey sighting. Said you could set your calendar by their migrations. For a brief moment, we were just siblings again, sharing memories of our father. Then Thomas's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening once more. Vanessa wants breakfast, he said, standing up. We're heading back to Denver this afternoon, but we'll be back next weekend. Her designer wants to take measurements for the renovation plans. Just like that, the wall between us rebuilt itself. Thomas, I said as he turned to leave. Before you invest any more in those plans, you should know that I've been in touch with Howard. He's filing Dad's codicil with the court. Thomas froze. What codicil? The one Dad signed 2 weeks before he died, leaving the lake house solely to me. I met his gaze steadily. It's notarized, witnessed, and entirely legal. His face flushed with anger. You're lying. I wish I were, I said. Honestly, I never wanted this fight, Tom. All I wanted was to preserve what Dad created here, what he loved. We'll contest it, he snapped. If it even exists. Dad wasn't in his right mind at the end. His doctor will testify otherwise, I said. So will his hospice nurse. So will Howard, who witnessed the document. Thomas's jaw worked as he processed this information. Finally, he said, Vanessa's not going to accept this. She's got her heart set on this place. Vanessa never cared about this place until she realized its market value, I replied, more sharply than I intended. And neither did you, if we're being honest. He turned away without another word, stalking back toward the house where Vanessa was no doubt waiting impatiently for her organic breakfast. I remained on the dock, watching the ripples spread across the water's surface, feeling the weight of what was to come. The battle lines were drawn now. There would be no peaceful resolution, no compromise that could satisfy both our visions for this place. But for the first time since Dad died, I felt certain I was doing the right thing. Not just for myself, but for him, for the legacy he had entrusted to me. Lake House would remain a sanctuary, not a showpiece. I would make sure of it. True to their word, Thomas and Vanessa left that afternoon, the BMW kicking up gravel as they sped down the driveway. Only after their taillights disappeared around the bend did I allow myself to truly breathe again. The house felt emptier, cleaner somehow, as if their departure had lifted a heavy fog. I spent the remainder of the day reclaiming the space, moving furniture back to its original positions, returning Dad's leather chair to its rightful place by the window, replacing his books on the shelves. Each item restored felt like a small victory, a silent affirmation that this place would remain as he had loved it. That evening, Howard called with an update. The codicil has been filed, he said, his voice crackling slightly over the spotty cell connection. I've also sent formal notice to Thomas and his attorney. They have 30 days to contest if they choose to. And if they do? I asked, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of amber and gold. Then we go to court, Howard said simply. But Joanne, you should know, this won't be easy. Family disputes rarely are. Thomas might drag up. Painful history. Question your father's competence. Even challenge your own motives. Are you prepared for that? I thought of Dad's letter, of his trust in me to protect this place. I am, I said firmly. Whatever it takes. The week passed in peaceful solitude. I worked remotely, set up at Dad's old desk overlooking the water. I swam in the early mornings when the lake was still and quiet. I tended to the garden, pulling weeds that had sprung up around Mom's roses. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt a sense of healing beginning to take root. Then Friday arrived, bringing with it an email from Thomas's attorney, a formal notice contesting the codicil, claiming Dad had been unduly influenced and lacked testamentary capacity when he signed it. The accusations were thinly veiled. I had manipulated our dying father, taken advantage of his weakened state, coerced him into changing his will. The words burned like acid. How dare they? How dare they twist my care for Dad into something sinister? I forwarded the email to Howard, hands shaking with anger. He called within minutes. "This is standard procedure in will contests," he assured me. "They're throwing mud at the sea. Wall to see what sticks. We have Dr. Levinson's records confirming your father was mentally competent. We have my own testimony as witness. Don't let this rattle you." Easier said than done. The accusations haunted me as I prepared for Thomas and Vanessa's return the next day. I considered locking them out, changing the locks, posting no trespassing signs, but Howard advised against it. Until the court rules definitively, antagonizing them will only complicate matters. So I waited, tension coiling tighter with each passing hour, until their car once again appeared in the driveway. This time, they weren't alone. A sleek woman in her 50s emerged from the passenger seat, clutching a leather portfolio and surveying the property with calculating eyes. The designer, no doubt. I greeted them at the door, civil but cool. "Thomas, Vanessa, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "Change of plans," Thomas replied curtly. "This is Elaine Westcott, our interior designer. She needs to take measurements and assess the structural elements before we can proceed with renovations." "I'm afraid there won't be any renovations," I said calmly. "Not until the court rules on Dad's codicil." Vanessa's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched. "We received your little legal notice. Our attorney says it won't hold up. Then we'll let the judge decide," I replied. "In the meantime, no structural changes to the property." The designer glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension. "Perhaps I should come back another time." "No," Thomas said firmly. "We're proceeding as planned. My sister doesn't have the authority to stop basic improvements to the property." "Improvements?" I echoed. "Like replacing handcrafted woodwork with sheetrock? Or tearing down the growth chart wall? Those aren't improvements, Thomas. They're erasures." Elaine cleared her throat uncomfortably. "I was told this was a straightforward modernization project." "It is," Vanessa insisted, shooting me a venomous, "Look, my sister-in-law is just having trouble letting go of the past. The house needs updating. It's practically a fire hazard with all this old wood." The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. Dad had been meticulous about maintenance, installing new wiring and updated fire suppression systems just 3 years ago. "Ms. Westcott," I said, addressing the designer directly, "I'm sure you're very talented, but you should know that this property is currently in legal dispute. Any work you do may have to be undone if the court rules in my favor." Elaine glanced at Thomas, who was glaring at me with undisguised hostility. "Perhaps I should speak with your attorney before proceeding," she suggested carefully. "That won't be necessary," Thomas snapped. "Take your measurements. We'll deal with the legal issues separately." But the seed of doubt had been planted. Elaine proceeded with her assessment, but I noticed her making notes about client dispute and potential legal complications in her portfolio. Small victories. That evening, an uneasy truce settled over the house. Thomas and Vanessa sequestered themselves in the master bedroom, while I retreated to the porch with a glass of Dad's favorite whiskey and the battered copy of Thoreau's Walden that he'd read every summer for as long as I could remember. The peace was shattered just after 9 when my phone rang. Howard again, his voice tight with concern. "Joanne, I've just received notice that Thomas has filed for an emergency injunction to prevent you from disposing of or damaging property assets. He's claiming you've been removing items of value from the house." "What?" I stood up, pacing the porch in disbelief. "That's completely false. I've been restoring things, not removing them." "Nevertheless, there will be a hearing on Monday. The judge has ordered that neither party make any changes to the property in the interim." Howard paused. "Joanne, this suggests they're escalating, preparing for a more aggressive approach." After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, watching the moonlight dance across the lake's surface. What were they planning? What new depths would they sink to in pursuit of a property they had never truly valued? My answer came at dawn. I woke to the sound of voices, multiple voices, and heavy footsteps on the gravel drive. Pulling on a robe, I hurried downstairs to find Thomas directing a team of workers unloading equipment from a large truck. Plastic sheeting, power tools, industrial garbage bags, all the trappings of a major renovation. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, stepping onto the porch. "The court ordered no changes to the property." Thomas turned, a smug smile playing at his lips. "Emergency repairs aren't covered by the injunction." "The bathroom? Pipes are leaking, threatening structural damage. We're simply addressing an urgent maintenance issue." "There's no leak," I said flatly. "I've been here all week." "Our plumber disagrees," Thomas replied, gesturing to a man in coveralls who nodded on cue. "He identified significant water damage yesterday." It was a transparent lie, but the workers continued unloading, heading toward the upstairs bathroom, the one with the hand-painted tiles Mom had installed when we were children. "Stop," I said, my voice rising. "This is illegal. You're violating a court order." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Prove it. By the time your lawyer gets a judge to intervene, the old bathroom will be gone." Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, Joe. Rage boiled within me, but I forced myself to think strategically. Confrontation was exactly what they wanted, an excuse to paint me as unstable, unreasonable, unfit to maintain the property. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began methodically photographing and filming everything. The workers, the equipment, the perfectly intact bathroom they claimed needed emergency repair. I captured Thomas giving directions, Vanessa gleefully selecting new fixtures from a catalog. I documented the date and time, the lack of any visible water damage, the absence of proper permits taped to the door. Then I called the county building inspector and the local police, and a news reporter from the Flathead Beacon who had written extensively about conservation issues and development disputes along the lake. Within an hour, the property was swarming with officials. The building inspector confirmed no permits had been issued for renovation work. The police officer, an old friend of Dad's, took statements from all parties. The reporter took photographs, asking pointed questions about conservation easements and inheritance disputes. Thomas was livid, his face flushed with anger as the workers were ordered to pack up and leave. "You've made a serious mistake," he hissed when we were momentarily alone. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed calmly. "It isn't. But Dad's legacy will be protected one way or another." Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor, Elaine Westcott, the interior designer, who had quietly slipped away during the morning's chaos. "I wanted to apologize," she said, standing awkwardly on the porch. "I had no idea the situation was so contentious. Your brother represented this as a simple renovation project with full family agreement." I invited her in, offering coffee, which she accepted gratefully. As we sat at the kitchen table, the same sturdy pine table where our family had shared thousands of meals, Elaine confided that she was withdrawing from the project. "I've been in this business 30 years, she said, cradling her mug. "I've seen family disputes before, but this—" She shook her head. "There's something special about this place. I felt it the moment I walked in. Tearing it apart would be a crime." Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit. Someone else could see it, could feel the soul of this place that Dad had poured his heart into. "Thank you," I said, simply. "That means more than you know." After she left, I called Howard with an update. "Good work," he said approvingly. "The documented violation of the court order strengthens our position considerably. The hearing on Monday may now work in our favor." That night, Thomas and Vanessa dined in stony silence at the far end of the porch, while I sat at Dad's desk, organizing documentation for Monday's hearing. The gulf between us seemed unbridgeable now, no longer just siblings with different priorities, but adversaries in a battle that had grown far beyond a simple property dispute. As I watched them through the window, heads bent close in conspiratorial whispers, I wondered what new strategy they were concocting. Whatever it was, I would be ready, for Dad's sake, for the sake of the legacy he had entrusted to me. The lake rippled silver in the moonlight, constant and unchanging, despite the human drama unfolding on its shores. Its permanence comforted me. Long after our disputes were settled, long after we were all gone, the lake would remain, just as Dad had taught me. Some things were meant to endure. Monday's hearing was brief but decisive. The judge, a silver-haired woman, with piercing blue eyes, listened to both sides with impassive attention. Thomas's attorney presented the case for shared ownership, emphasizing family equity and arguing that Dad's codicil had been executed under duress. Howard countered with medical records, witness testimony, and, most damaging to Thomas's case, the documented attempt to begin renovations in direct violation of the court order. The court finds sufficient evidence to uphold the codicil pending full probate proceedings, the judge announced. Furthermore, given the demonstrated disregard for previous court instructions, exclusive temporary possession of the property is granted to Joanne Ramsey until final determination of ownership. The words took a moment to register. Exclusive possession. Thomas and Vanessa would have to leave. They couldn't return until the case was fully resolved, a process that could take months. Thomas stormed out of the courtroom without a word. Vanessa lingered just long enough to fix me with a glacial stare. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody crosses me and walks away unscathed." Howard squeezed my shoulder reassuringly. "Empty threats," he murmured, as we watched them leave. "They know they're losing ground." I wasn't so sure. There was something in Vanessa's eyes, a calculated fury that sent a chill down my spine despite the summer heat. By the time I returned to the lake house that afternoon, Thomas and Vanessa had already departed, leaving chaos in their wake. Drawers pulled open and emptied onto the floor, closets ransacked, Dad's desk upended, papers scattered across the room. But it wasn't random vandalism. This was a search, methodical despite its apparent disarray. They had been looking for something. I spent hours restoring order, trying to determine if anything was missing. Dad's valuable fishing gear remained untouched in the boat shed. Mom's jewelry, the few pieces I'd kept, was still in my dresser drawer. The silverware, the antique decoys Dad collected, the first edition Hemingway he'd treasured, all accounted for. Whatever they had been seeking, I couldn't identify it. As dusk settled over the lake, I found myself drawn back to the attic. Something about the trunk nagged at my mind, a feeling that I'd missed something important. The codicil had been hidden there, yes, but what if there was more? What if that's what Thomas and Vanessa had been searching for? I climbed the narrow stairs once more, switching on the single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the rafters. The trunk sat undisturbed in its corner, apparently overlooked in their hasty search. I knelt beside it, opening the creaking lid, and began a more thorough examination than I'd conducted before. This time, I removed everything. The photo albums, the wedding dress carefully preserved in tissue paper, the old letters bound with faded ribbon. At the very bottom, beneath a layer of cedar shavings meant to deter moths, I found a false bottom, a thin wooden panel that lifted away to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound journal I'd never seen before, its pages yellowed with age, and a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. My hands trembled as I lifted out the journal, opening to the first page inscribed in Dad's familiar handwriting. The truth about Flathead. A.R. I began reading, and the world around me fell away. The journal was Dad's personal account of how he had acquired the lake property, a story far different from the one he'd told us growing up. He hadn't simply purchased the land from a retiring doctor, as family lore maintained. The truth was more complex, more troubling. The property had once belonged to the Blackfeet tribe, part of their ancestral territory. During the 1960s land disputes, it had been questionably appropriated by the state and sold to private owners. Dad, then a young architect just starting his career, had purchased it in good faith, unaware of its complicated history. It wasn't until years later, when he befriended Joseph Eaglefeather, a Blackfeet elder who recognized the property, that Dad learned the truth. The journal detailed their friendship, the guilt Dad felt upon discovering the land's history, and the unusual arrangement they eventually reached. "I cannot return what was wrongfully taken," Dad had written, "but I can ensure it is honored and protected. Joseph and I have agreed. The land will remain undeveloped, its natural state preserved, and a portion of its value will support Blackfeet educational initiatives. This commitment binds not just me, but all who inherit this place." The wooden box contained legal documents, a trust Dad had established 30 years ago, allocating a percentage of the property's assessed value to a scholarship fund for Blackfeet youth. Along with it was a formal agreement with the Montana Land Reliance, placing most of the property under conservation easement. And there was something else, a separate agreement, signed by Dad and Joseph Eaglefeather, stipulating that if the terms of the conservation agreement were ever violated, ownership would revert to Joseph's descendants. I sat back, stunned by the implications. This wasn't just about who inherited a vacation home. This was about an ethical commitment Dad had made, a promise to right a historical wrong as best he could, a promise that Thomas's development plans would directly violate. No wonder Dad had been so insistent that the property come to me. He knew I would honor its true purpose, while Thomas would see only its market value. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Is this Joanne Ramsey?" A deep voice, weathered with age. "My name is Michael Eagle Feather. I believe we need to talk about your father's property." My heart raced. "You're Joseph's son?" A pause. "Grandson. My grandfather passed 15 years ago, but he made sure I understood the agreement with your father. I've been monitoring the situation since Arthur's death. How did you get my number?" I asked, though the answer seemed suddenly obvious. "Your father gave it to me shortly before he died. He was concerned about what might happen to the property." Michael's voice softened slightly. "He spoke very highly of you, Ms. Ramsey. Said you understood the land. In a way your brother never could." We arranged to meet the following day at a cafe in Big Fork. As I hung up, pieces began falling into place. Why Dad had been so adamant about the conservation easement. Why he'd insisted I inherit the property. Why he'd hidden the codicil rather than simply updating his will publicly. He had been protecting not just the land, but the promise he'd made. A promise that could now be leveraged to permanently prevent Thomas's development schemes. I descended from the attic with the journal and documents clutched to my chest, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within me. Grief at this new dimension of Dad I'd never fully known, pride in his integrity, his determination to do right by the land and its original stewards, and a renewed sense of purpose in the battle that lay ahead. The lake was a perfect mirror that evening, reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. I stood on the dock, watching a family of otters play along the shoreline, their sleek bodies diving and surfacing with joyful abandon. This was what Dad had protected. Not just scenic views for our family's enjoyment, but a living ecosystem, a small piece of wilderness, preserved amid increasing development. Thomas and Vanessa had unknowingly set themselves against something far larger than a sister's inheritance claim. They had positioned themselves against history itself, against a promise decades in the making. For the first time since the conflict began, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The rightness of my position had powerful allies Thomas couldn't begin to imagine. Back in the house, I called Howard, explaining what I'd discovered. He listened in thoughtful silence, then let out a low whistle. "This changes everything," he said. "If the Eagle Feather family decides to enforce the reversion clause based on Thomas's attempted violations of the conservation easement, he could lose any claim to the property entirely." "Is that what I should push for?" I asked, uncertain despite the apparent advantage. Howard hesitated. "That's not a legal question, Joanne. That's a question of family, of legacy, of what your father would have wanted. You need to decide how far you're willing to go." As I lay in bed that night, Dad's journal on the nightstand beside me, I wrestled with that very question. Did I want to sever ties with my only sibling completely? Did I want to win at any cost? Dad's voice seemed to whisper from the journal's pages. "The land teaches us to take only what we need, to leave enough for those who come after. That's the lesson I hope my children learn from this place." Tomorrow, I would meet Michael Eagle Feather. Together, perhaps we could find a path that honored both Dad's promise and the complex bonds of family, however strained they had become. Outside my window, an owl called into the darkness, its haunting cry a reminder that some things transcended human disputes. The land would endure, with or without us. Our only choice was whether to be its protectors or its exploiters. I chose protection. I chose Dad's legacy. I chose the promise he had made, and that I would now uphold. The cafe in Big Fork, where I agreed to meet Michael Eagle Feather, was a small, wood-paneled establishment overlooking the Swan River as it emptied into Flathead Lake. Early morning light streamed through the windows, glinting off the rushing water below. I arrived 20 minutes early, clutching Dad's journal and the legal documents I'd discovered, unsure what to expect from this meeting. I recognized Michael immediately when he entered. A tall man in his early 40s with copper skin, jet black hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they fell upon. He wore jeans, a chambray shirt, and a leather jacket despite the summer heat. Something about his posture, straight-backed, deliberate, reminded me of Dad. Joanne Ramsey, he said, extending his hand as he approached my table. His grip was firm, his gaze direct. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I gestured to the chair across from me. Thank you for reaching out. I had no idea about the agreement between your grandfather and my father until yesterday. Michael nodded, settling into the chair. Arthur was a man of his word, but he was also private about his commitments. My grandfather respected that. His eyes fell on Dad's journal. Is that his? Yes, I said, pushing it across the table. I found it hidden in a trunk in the attic, along with these. I laid out the legal documents, the trust agreement, the conservation easement paperwork, and the private contract between Joseph Eaglefeather and my father. Michael examined each document carefully, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, he closed the journal and looked up at me. Your father was an unusual man. When he learned about the history of that land, many would have dismissed it or defended their legal right to ownership. Instead, he sought out my grandfather and tried to make amends in the only way he could. I had no idea, I admitted. He never told us, never told me, about any of this. The agreement was personal to them, Michael explained. It wasn't about public recognition or clearing a guilty conscience. It was about respect for the land and for history. He paused as a server delivered coffee to our table. My grandfather believed that land doesn't truly belong to people. People belong to the land. Your father came to understand that. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, finding comfort in its solidity. And now my brother wants to develop the property, build vacation rentals, clear trees for better views, install a dock for motorboats. Michael's expression hardened. That would violate both the conservation easement and our agreement. Yes, I confirmed, though Thomas doesn't know about your family's claim yet. And you? Michael asked, studying me intently. How do you feel about this inheritance now that you know its true history? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on fighting Thomas that I hadn't fully processed the moral implications of my own claim to the property. I've always loved that land, I said slowly, choosing my words with care. Not for what it's worth, but for what it is. The trees, the water, the wildlife. I thought that's why Dad wanted me to have it. Now I see it was more than that. He was entrusting me with a promise. Michael nodded, a hint of approval warming his stoic features. The question now is what we do about your brother's development plans. I took a deep breath. Legally, I have temporary exclusive possession of the property until the ownership dispute is resolved. But Thomas won't give up easily. He and Vanessa see dollar signs, not sacred trust. We could invoke the reversion clause, Michael said matter-of-factly. Based on their documented attempts to violate the conservation easement, we'd have grounds to reclaim ownership for the Blackfeet. The possibility hung in the air between us. It would solve my problem with Thomas permanently. He couldn't fight a claim that predated Dad's ownership. But it would also mean losing the lake house myself, surrendering the place that held all my cherished memories of Mom and Dad. Is that what you want? I asked quietly. Michael considered the question, his dark eyes thoughtful. What I want is for the land to be respected, for the promises made to be kept. He leaned forward slightly. My grandfather could have pushed for full reversion when he discovered the property's history. Instead, he and your father found middle ground, conservation and educational support in exchange for continued family stewardship. I'm willing to honor that compromise if you are. Relief washed over me. I am, completely. Then perhaps we can find a solution that respects both our families' connections to this place, Michael suggested. One, that permanently prevents development while acknowledging both its past and present caretakers. We spent the next 2 hours crafting a proposal, a new legal framework that would strengthen the conservation easement, formalize the educational trust, and create a joint stewardship arrangement between my family and the Eagle Feathers. The lake house itself would remain in my ownership, but the surrounding land would be held in a trust with strict preservation requirements. Your brother won't like this, Michael warned as we finished our third cups of coffee. It eliminates any possibility of commercial development now or in the future. No, he won't, I agreed. But it gives him a choice. Accept these terms and maintain a connection to the property, or fight and risk losing everything, if the reversion clause is invoked. As we parted ways outside the cafe, Michael clasped my hand in both of his. Your father would be proud, he said simply. He spoke of you often in his later years. He never mentioned you, I admitted, then added hastily, but I wish he had. I wish I'd known this part of him, of our family's story. Michael smiled, the first full smile I'd seen from him. He was protecting you, I think, waiting until you were ready. And now you are. I drove back to the lake house with a lighter heart than I'd felt in months. The path ahead was still challenging. Thomas would resist, lawyers would argue, paperwork would need to be filed. But for the first time, I felt absolutely certain of the rightness of my position. That certainty was tested the very next day when Howard called with disturbing news. "Thomas has filed a new motion," he reported grimly. "He's alleging that you're mentally unstable, claiming that grief has affected your judgment, and that you're unfit to manage the property. He's requesting a psychological evaluation and temporary conservatorship." The accusation knocked the breath from my lungs. "That's absurd. On what grounds?" "He's submitted affidavits from Vanessa and two of their friends claiming you exhibited erratic behavior and paranoid tendencies during their visit. They're citing your call to the police and building inspector as evidence of overreaction." Rage burned through me, hot and blinding. "They were violating a court order. The building inspector confirmed it." "I know," Howard said soothingly. "And the judge will know it too. This is a desperate tactic, Joanne. They're flailing." "It's cruel," I whispered, hurt beyond measure that my own brother would stoop so low. "It's vicious and it's cruel." "It is," Howard agreed, "but it also tells us something important. They're running out of legitimate options. They wouldn't resort to character assassination if they thought they could win on the merits." After hanging up, I sat on the porch for hours, watching the light change on the water as I struggled to process this latest betrayal. Thomas had moved beyond legal maneuvering into something far more personal and damaging. He was willing to paint me as unstable, to suggest I needed guardianship, all to gain control of property he had never truly valued. I thought of Dad, of his integrity even when no one was watching, of how he had sought to right a historical wrong not out of guilt or fear of exposure, but because it was the right thing to do. What would he think of his son now, of what Thomas had become in his pursuit of material gain? The sun was setting when I made my decision. I wouldn't respond with matching venom. I wouldn't sink to their level. Instead, I would bring everything into the light, the full history of the property, Dad's journal, the agreement with the eagle feathers, and Thomas's attempts to circumvent not just Dad's wishes, but a decades-old ethical commitment. I called Michael first, explaining Thomas's new allegations and my proposed response. He listened quietly, then offered his family's full support. "Truth has a power all its own," he said. "Let it speak." Next, I called Howard, outlining my plan. He was cautious but supportive. "It's risky," he warned. "Once the eagle feather agreement is introduced in court, it becomes a matter of public record. Thomas will know about the reversion clause. He might become even more desperate. Or he might finally understand what's really at stake here," I countered. "Either way, I'm done with secrets and half-truths." Dad kept this quiet to protect the promise, but now that promise itself needs protection. For the next 3 days, I prepared meticulously, organizing documents, making copies of Dad's journal, assembling photographs that documented the land's ecological significance. I reached out to the Montana Land Reliance, explaining the situation and securing their representation at the upcoming hearing. I contacted Dad's doctor and his hospice nurse, both of whom readily agreed to testify about his mental clarity in his final months. The night before the hearing, I took Dad's old canoe out onto the lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the mountains and sky like a flawless mirror. I paddled to the center of the bay, then let the canoe drift as I watched the first stars appear overhead. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Dad," I whispered to the gathering darkness. "I hope this is what you would have wanted." No mystical answer came, no sign or portent, just the gentle lapping of water against the canoe and the distant call of a loon across the lake. But somehow, in that peaceful moment, I found the certainty I needed. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would stand for truth, complicated, messy, human truth. And in doing so, I would honor not just Dad's memory, but the deeper legacy he had tried to establish. As I paddled back to shore, a bald eagle soared overhead, its white head gleaming in the last light of day. In the Blackfeet tradition, I remembered, eagles were messengers between earth and sky, between humans and the divine. I chose to take it as a blessing on the path ahead. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, perhaps the final battle in this painful war with my brother. But tonight, under the vast Montana sky, I found peace in knowing I stood on the side of something larger than myself, larger even than family bonds and personal grief. I stood on the side of promises kept, of land respected, of history acknowledged. Whatever the cost, that was worth fighting for. The county courthouse in Kalispell was a stately brick building with tall windows and high ceilings that amplified every footstep, every whispered conversation. I arrived early, accompanied by Howard, Michael Eaglefeather, and Sarah Linden from the Montana Land Reliance. Thomas and Vanessa were already there, seated with their attorney, a sharp-featured woman in an expensive suit who exuded aggressive competence. Thomas wouldn't meet my eyes as we took our places on opposite sides of the courtroom. Vanessa, however, stared openly, her expression a mixture of contempt and smug anticipation. She clearly expected today's hearing to go their way. Judge Eleanor Michaels entered, the same silver-haired woman who had granted me temporary possession of the property. Her keen eyes swept the courtroom, lingering briefly on Michael and Sarah, whose presence she hadn't anticipated. "We have several motions before the court today," she began, shuffling through papers. "Mr. Ramsey's request for psychological evaluation of Ms. Ramsey, Ms. Ramsey's motion to dismiss that request, and—" She paused, looking up with raised eyebrows. "A new filing this morning from Ms. Ramsey introducing additional documentation regarding the property's legal status. Quite a full docket." Thomas's attorney rose first. "Your Honor, we'd like to address the psychological evaluation request as a matter of priority. My client has serious concerns about his sister's mental state following their father's death." The judge nodded. "Proceed, but be concise." What followed was a character assassination so breathtaking in its dishonesty that I had to dig my nails into my palms to maintain composure. Thomas's attorney painted me as unstable, paranoid, irrationally attached to the property, and potentially violent. She cited the incident with the building inspector as evidence of my deteriorating mental state, and suggested that grief had rendered me incapable of rational decisions regarding the property. Vanessa testified, describing with feigned concern how I had become increasingly erratic and refused reasonable compromises. She cleverly mixed truth with lies. Yes, I had called the authorities, but only because they were violating a court order. Yes, I had been emotional about their renovation plans, but only because they threatened to destroy irreplaceable family history. Thomas spoke last, his voice carrying just the right note of brotherly concern. "I'm worried about Joe," he said, using my childhood nickname for the first time in years. "Since Dad died, she's become fixated on the lake house. She won't consider any changes, any updates, any sharing arrangement. It's not healthy, and it's not what Dad would have wanted for either of us." Y'all, hypocrisy was staggering. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached. When it was our turn, Howard methodically dismantled their claims. He presented the building inspector's report confirming there had been no leak requiring emergency repairs. He submitted affidavits from my colleagues attesting to my continued professional competence and emotional stability. Most damning, he played the recording I had made of Thomas admitting that the renovation was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the court order. "Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission," in his own words. "Your Honor," Howard concluded, "this motion isn't about Ms. Ramsey's mental health. It's a transparent attempt to gain control of valuable property through character assassination. We ask that it be dismissed with prejudice." Judge Michaels removed her reading glasses, fixing Thomas with a stern gaze. "Mr. Ramsey, I find the timing and nature of these allegations troubling, particularly in light of your documented attempt to violate this court's previous order. Your motion is denied." A flash of anger crossed Thomas's face before he could mask it. Vanessa's manicured nails dug into his arm, her expression thunderous. "Now," the judge continued, "regarding Ms. Ramsey's new filing, this appears to introduce significant new information about the property's legal status. Ms. Ramsey, would you care to explain?" I stood, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "Your Honor, I recently discovered documents that reveal the full history of the Flathead Lake property. These documents were hidden by my father, I believe to protect certain promises he had made. I explained about finding Dad's journal, about the property's connection to the Blackfeet tribe, about the agreement between Dad and Joseph Eaglefeather. As I spoke, I could feel Thomas's growing shock, could see Vanessa whispering urgently to their attorney. Michael Eaglefeather testified next, confirming the agreement and explaining its cultural significance. "This wasn't just a legal arrangement," he said. "It was a commitment to respect the land's history and ensure its protection. Arthur Ramsay understood that some things are more valuable preserved than developed. Sarah Linden from the Land Reliance followed, detailing the conservation easement and the severe legal consequences of its violation. The attempted renovations Mr. Ramsay initiated would have directly contravened several provisions of the easement, she explained. This could trigger not only financial penalties, but, given the connection to the separate agreement with the Eagle Feather family, potentially more severe consequences, including reversion of ownership. By the time all testimony concluded, the dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Thomas and his attorney were huddled in intense conversation. Vanessa sat rigid, her earlier confidence evaporated. Judge Michaels called a brief recess to review the new documents. When court resumed 30 minutes later, she delivered her ruling with characteristic directness. The court finds that Arthur Ramsay's intentions regarding the Flathead Lake property were clear and consistent. The codicil leaving the property to Joanne Ramsay is valid and will be upheld. Furthermore, the conservation easement and the agreement with the Eagle Feather family are legally binding and must be respected by any party claiming interest in the property. She looked directly at Thomas. Mr. Ramsay, your father made commitments regarding this land that transcend normal inheritance considerations. The court strongly advises you to reconsider your position in light of today's revelations. Thomas's attorney requested a brief consultation with her client. The judge granted a 15-minute recess, during which Howard, Michael, Sarah, and I waited in tense silence in a small conference room. They're reassessing their options, Howard observed. The Eagle Feather Agreement changes everything. If they push forward with development plans and trigger the reversion clause, Thomas could lose any connection to the property entirely. Do you think he'll back down? I asked, not daring to hope. Michael shrugged. It depends on what matters more to him. Having some relationship with the property on its own terms, or nothing at all. When we returned to the courtroom, Thomas's attorney announced that her client wished to address the court. Thomas stood, his composure cracked, his earlier polish diminished. Your Honor, I was unaware of my father's arrangements with the Eagle Feather family or the full extent of the conservation easement. In light of this new information, he paused, clearly struggling. I wish to withdraw my contest of the codicil and acknowledge my sister's full ownership of the property, with the understanding that I will have reasonable visitation rights. Shock rippled through me. Was this capitulation real, or another strategy? The judge turned to me. Ms. Ramsay, are you amenable to such an arrangement? I looked at Thomas, really looked at him, for the first time in months. Behind the anger and ambition, I glimpsed something unexpected. Fear. Fear of losing his last connection to Dad, to our shared childhood, to the place that, despite everything, held meaning for him too. I am, Your Honor, I said carefully, with certain conditions regarding the conservation easement and the Eagle Feather Agreement, which must be formally acknowledged and respected. So ordered, Judge Michaels declared. The parties will draft a detailed agreement, covering ownership, visitation rights, and conservation commitments for the court's approval within 30 days. This matter is adjourned. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Thomas approached hesitantly, Vanessa conspicuously absent from his side. Can we talk? He asked, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Privately, we found an empty bench in the courthouse hallway. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The gulf between us seemed simultaneously vast and paper-thin. Why didn't you tell me? Thomas finally asked. About Dad's agreement with the Eagle Feathers. About the reversion clause. I only found out myself 3 days ago, I said honestly. Dad kept it private. I think he hoped it would never be necessary to reveal it. Thomas nodded slowly. I didn't. No, about any of it. The conservation easement, the scholarship fund, the property's history. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Dad that it made my chest ache. I thought he left it to you because you were his favorite, because you were there at the end and I wasn't. It wasn't about favoritism, I said softly. It was about understanding. He knew I would protect the land the way he had, the way he had promised to. And he assumed I wouldn't, Thomas said, a hint of bitterness creeping back into his tone. Would you have? I challenged gently. If you had inherited the property without knowing its history, would you have preserved it as it was, or would you have developed it as you and Vanessa planned? He didn't answer directly, which was answer enough. I just wanted my share, he said finally. My piece of Dad. You had him those last years. I had quarterly phone calls and Christmas visits. The admission cracked something open between us, a glimpse of the real pain driving his actions. Not just greed or Vanessa's influence, but a deeper wound. The feeling of being left behind, left out of Dad's inner circle. That was your choice, I reminded. Him, but without accusation. Dad would have welcomed more visits, more calls. He asked about you constantly. I know, Thomas whispered. I know that now. Too late. We sat in silence again. The weight of missed opportunities, of time that couldn't be reclaimed, settling between us. Then Thomas straightened, his businessman's mask slipping back into place. Vanessa and I are separating, he said, abruptly. She's not pleased with how this turned out. I wasn't surprised. Vanessa had wanted a trophy property, a showcase for her social media brand. Without that prospect, Thomas himself might have lost considerable value in her eyes. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it despite everything. No one deserved the cold calculation I'd witnessed in Vanessa. Don't be. It's been coming for a while. Thomas stood, adjusting his suit jacket. I should go. We'll have our attorney draft the agreement as ordered. As he turned to leave, I called after him. Thomas, when it's done, when everything's official, you should come to the lake. Just you. See it again through new eyes. He paused, his back to me, then nodded once without turning around. I watched him walk away, his shoulders slightly stooped, a man forced to reconsider not just his inheritance but perhaps his entire value system. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayals too deep, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall between us, a possibility I hadn't dared hope for amid the bitterness of our battle. Outside the courthouse, Michael and Howard waited. It's over? Michael asked. The legal fight is? I confirmed. The healing? That's just beginning. As we walked down the courthouse steps into the bright Montana sunshine, I felt the weight of months of conflict beginning to lift. The lake house was safe. Dad's promise would be kept. And perhaps in time, something of my relationship with Thomas might be salvaged from the wreckage of our inheritance war. It wasn't a perfect ending. But like the land itself, complex, layered with history both painful and precious, it was real. And it was enough. Autumn arrived in Flathead with a painter's touch. Aspens turned gold almost overnight, their trembling leaves catching sunlight like coins. The tamaracks followed, their needles transforming from green to amber before they would eventually fall. The lake reflected these changes, its surface shifting from summer's deep blue to a palette of copper and bronze as the season deepened. I had spent most of the summer at the lake house, working remotely when possible, commuting to Seattle when necessary. The legal proceedings were finally complete. The agreement signed, the ownership officially transferred, the conservation commitment strengthened and expanded. The property was mine, with Thomas granted specific visitation rights and a small cabin area where he could eventually build a modest structure if he chose, subject to strict environmental guidelines. In those quiet months, I had begun the delicate work of restoration, not renovation, but rather a careful tending to what already existed. I replaced worn floorboards with matching pine, painstakingly sourced from sustainable forests. I resealed windows, repaired the dock, and gently restored Mom's garden, which had grown wild in recent years. Each repair felt like an act of love, a conversation with Dad across the divide of death. I often found myself talking to him as I worked, imagining his advice on the proper way to mix stain or the correct angle for a saw cut. In those moments, the ache of his absence transformed into something else, a presence that lived in the precise joining of wood, in the careful preservation of what he had built. Michael Eagle Feather became a regular visitor, bringing his teenage son and daughter to help with various projects. His son, Joseph, named for his great-grandfather, had a natural talent for woodworking that would have delighted Dad. His daughter, Emma, took a keen interest in the native plants, helping me identify and protect the indigenous species that belonged in this ecosystem. My grandfather would be pleased, Michael commented one October afternoon as we sat on the porch, watching the children rake fallen leaves in the yard. Not just that the agreement was honored, but that this has become a place of learning again. I nodded, understanding what he meant. The property was coming alive with new purpose, not just as my private sanctuary, but as a place where the Eagle Feather family could reconnect with ancestral land, where local environmental science students could conduct lake research, where the past and future could coexist in respectful balance. I've been thinking about expanding the educational component, I told him, warming my hands around a mug of spiced cider. Setting up a small natural history center in the boathouse, focused on the lake ecosystem and Blackfeet connections to the land. Nothing commercial, just a resource for schools, researchers, community members. Michael considered this, his expression thoughtful. It would need to be done carefully, respectfully. Of course, I wouldn't proceed without your family's involvement at every step. It would be a partnership. He nodded slowly. I like the idea. A place where multiple truths can be told. He gestured toward the lake, where late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the water. This place has always held stories. Might as well make sure they're the right ones. As we talked, a car appeared on the gravel drive, a modest sedan I didn't recognize, moving cautiously as if the driver was uncertain of their welcome. When it parked, I was stunned to see Thomas emerge, alone and dressed in casual clothes I barely recognized on him. Jeans, a flannel shirt, hiking boots. He stood by the car for a long moment, taking in the scene, before approaching the porch with visible hesitation. I should have called first, he said, stopping at the, bottom of the steps. I can come back another time. No, I said quickly, rising to my feet. No, it's fine. You're welcome here. Michael stood as well, extending his hand to Thomas. Michael Eaglefeather. We weren't properly introduced at the courthouse. Thomas shook his hand, clearly uncomfortable, but making an effort. Thomas Ramsey. I've been reading about your grandfather's agreement. With my father. It's a remarkable story. It is, Michael agreed simply. He glanced at me, then tactfully excused himself to join his children in the yard, leaving Thomas and me alone on the porch. An awkward silence stretched between us until Thomas finally spoke. The place looks good. You've been working on it. Just maintaining mostly, I said, gesturing to the chair Michael had vacated. Would you like to sit? There's cider if you want some. Thomas nodded, lowering himself into the chair with the stiffness of someone unsure of their place. I poured him cider from the thermos, noting the changes in him since the courthouse. He seemed thinner, the sharp edges of his corporate polish softened. There were new lines around his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Vanessa. And I finalized the divorce last month, he said abruptly, staring out at the lake rather than at me. She got the Denver house. I'm moving back to Seattle, actually. Taking a position at a smaller firm. Less pressure, more meaningful work. That's a big change, I said carefully, unsure how to respond to this sudden confidence. Thomas nodded, a humorless smile flickering across his face. The lake house battle was a wake-up call, made me look at what I'd become, what I valued. He took a sip of cider, his eyes still fixed on the distant shoreline. Dad would have hated the man I turned into. The raw honesty of the statement caught me off guard. I had expected many things from this eventual reunion. Awkwardness, lingering resentment, forced politeness, but not this vulnerable. Self-assessment. He never stopped loving you, I said quietly. Never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to what really mattered. Thomas turned to me then, his eyes suspiciously bright. I found his letter, you know. After the hearing, I went through some old papers he'd sent me, things I'd never bothered to read properly. There was a letter from 5 years ago talking about the conservation easement, about his friendship with Joseph Eaglefeather. He was trying to tell me in his way. I just wasn't listening. A lump formed in my throat. Dad had tried to include Thomas in this deeper legacy, had reached out in his characteristically understated way. The tragedy was that Thomas had been too busy, too focused on material success, to hear what was being offered. I'm sorry, Thomas said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. For everything. The legal battle, the accusations, the renovation attempt. Especially for saying you manipulated Dad. That was unforgivable. Not unforgivable, I corrected gently. Just painful. We both lost sight of what Dad would have wanted, for us to find a way forward together, however complicated. We lapsed into silence again, but it felt different now, less strained, more contemplative. In the yard, Joseph and Emma had finished with the leaves and were skipping stones on the lake's edge, Michael watching them with quiet pride. Is that part of the agreement? Thomas asked, nodding toward the Eaglefeather family. Regular visits? No, I explained. That's friendship. Michael has been helping me understand the land's history, its significance to his people. And his kids are just great, smart, respectful, genuinely interested in this place. Thomas watched them for a while, something shifting in his expression. I'd like to learn more about all of it. The conservation work, the Blackfeet connection, what Dad was trying to preserve. If you're willing to share that with me. The olive branch was tentative but sincere. After months of bitter conflict, Thomas was asking not for ownership or control, but for understanding, for inclusion in the deeper story of the land and our father's legacy. I'd like that, I said, meaning it despite the residual hurt between us. There's room in this story for both of us, Tom. There always was. As the afternoon light began to fade, Thomas helped Michael and the children secure the rowboat and close up the boathouse for the evening. I watched from the kitchen as I prepared a simple dinner, struck by the unexpected tableau, my brother working alongside the descendants of the land's original caretakers, all of them engaged in the basic, essential act of tending to this place. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. The wounds Thomas had, inflicted, were still healing, the trust between us fragile at best. But it was a beginning, a recognition that some legacies are too important to sacrifice on the altar of pride or greed. That night, after the eagle feathers had departed and Thomas had retired to the guest room, not Dad's room, he had declined that offer with unexpected sensitivity, I stood on the dock under a sky blazing with stars. The air was crisp with autumn's chill, the lake perfectly still. We're trying, Dad, I whispered to the reflection of the moon on the water. It's not perfect, but we're trying. A loon called in the darkness, its haunting cry echoing across the water, nature's response to human drama, a reminder that our conflicts were temporary while the rhythms of the land endured. In that moment, I felt Dad's presence more strongly than I had since his death, not as grief or loss, but as continuity, as wisdom passed from one generation to the next. The lake house would stand, its soul intact. The land would remain wild and protected, and perhaps, against all odds, the broken bonds of family might slowly, painfully begin to heal. It was enough. It had to be. Spring came late the following year, winter reluctant to release its grip on the mountains. By May, however, the lake had finally shed its stillness, coming alive with ripples and waves as migratory birds returned, and fish began their ancient spawning cycles. The world renewed itself, as it always did, regardless of human concerns. I had spent the winter alternating between Seattle and the lake house, finding a rhythm that allowed me to maintain my research position while deepening my connection to Dad's legacy. The small natural history center in the renovated boathouse was taking shape, with input from Michael's family, local environmental groups, and even Thomas, who had surprised me with his growing interest in conservation issues. True to his word, my brother had moved back to Seattle, taking a position with an architectural firm specializing in sustainable design. Our relationship remained tentative, marked by occasional awkwardness and old tensions that flared unexpectedly. But we were talking again, really talking, about Dad, about our childhoods, about the different paths we had taken, and the possibility of finding common ground. On a perfect May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the meadow and the mountains still snow-capped against a cloudless sky, we gathered at the lake house for a ceremony long in planning. The entire Eagle Feather family had come, Michael and his wife, their children, and several elders, including Michael's mother, Ruth, who had known Joseph when she was a young woman. Howard was there too, along with Sarah from the Land Reliance, and several of Dad's old friends from the area. Thomas arrived last, bringing with him a hand-carved cedar sign he had commissioned from a local Blackfeet artist. It would mark the entrance to the property, celebrating both its conservation status and its cultural significance. The gesture moved me deeply, evidence of how far he had come in understanding what this place truly meant. We gathered on the shore where the new dock had been built, simpler than what Thomas and Vanessa had envisioned, designed to minimize environmental impact while providing access for canoes and research boats. Ruth Eagle Feather, despite her 80 years, stood straight-backed as she addressed us in both English and Blackfeet, blessing the gathering and acknowledging the complex history we were all part of. "This land remembers," she said, her voice carrying clearly over the gentle lap of waves. "It remembers the feet of my ancestors, the coming of the settlers, the loss and the pain. But it also remembers kindness, respect, and promises kept. Today, we honor those promises and make new ones for the generations to come." Michael spoke next, explaining the significance of the agreement his grandfather and my father had made. Not just a legal document, but a bridge between communities, a recognition of shared responsibility to the earth. Then it was my turn. I had prepared remarks, but as I looked around at the gathered faces, at Thomas standing slightly apart but present, at Michael's children who had become almost like family to me, at the lake that had witnessed all of this unfolding, the formal words seemed inadequate. My father built this house with his own hands, I began, speaking from the heart. He taught me that we don't really own the places we love. We're just their temporary caretakers. It took losing him to truly understand what that meant. I glanced at Thomas, who met my eyes steadily, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. The past year has been difficult for many of us, I continued. There have been misunderstandings, hurt feelings, broken trust. But through it all, this place has remained what it always was, a sanctuary, a reminder of what matters most. Not property values or legal ownership, but connection. To the land, to history, to each other. I gestured to the small crowd gathered on the shore. Today, we're formalizing the joint stewardship agreement that will govern this property. Going forward, the lake house remains in my family's hands, but the land itself will be protected by multiple guardians, the Eagle Feather family, the Montana Land Reliance, and all of us who understand its value beyond dollars and cents. Sarah stepped forward with the documents, legally binding papers that expanded on Dad's original agreement, creating a formal structure for the educational programs, conservation efforts, and Blackfeet involvement with the property. We had spent months crafting these agreements, ensuring they would endure long after any of us were gone. One by one, the designated representatives signed. Myself, Michael, Sarah, and finally Thomas, whose inclusion had been my idea. Whatever our past conflicts, he was still Dad's son, still part of the legacy that was being preserved. His signature on the documents represented not just legal acknowledgement, but personal growth, a reclaiming of the values Dad had tried to instill in both of us. After the formal ceremony, we shared a meal on the porch, a potluck that blended cultures and traditions. Ruth brought traditional Blackfeet berry pudding, Howard contributed his famous smoked trout, Thomas surprised everyone with an impressively executed huckleberry pie he'd learned to make from one of Dad's old recipes. As afternoon stretched toward evening, people gradually departed, the Eagle Feather elders first, then Howard and Sarah, then Michael's family with promises to return the following weekend. Eventually, only Thomas and I remained, sitting on the dock as twilight settled over the water. Do you think Dad knew it would work out this way? Thomas asked, breaking a comfortable silence. When he made that codicil, when he hid all those documents, did he foresee all of this? I considered the question, watching an osprey circle high above the lake. Not specifically, I said finally, but I think he hoped we'd find our way to something like it. He believed in both of us, in different ways. Thomas nodded slowly. I still wish I'd been here more, at the end, that I'd listened when he tried to tell me about the eagle feathers, about what this place really meant. You're listening now, I pointed out. That counts for something. My brother smiled, a genuine smile that reminded me suddenly, painfully, of Dad. Better late than never, I guess. He hesitated, then added, I'm thinking of building that cabin next spring. Nothing fancy, just a simple place where I can stay when I visit, if that's still okay with you. It's more than okay, I assured him. It's what Dad would have wanted. Both his children connected to this place, in our own ways. As darkness fell, we lit the old oil lamps on the porch, another tradition Dad had maintained despite the availability of electric lighting. The soft golden glow spilled across the weathered boards, casting long shadows into the yard. In that gentle light, the house looked almost exactly as it had during our childhood, as if time had folded back on itself, offering us a second chance at honoring what mattered most. Thomas left the next morning, returning to Seattle with promises to visit again soon. I stood on the porch, watching his car disappear down the gravel drive, feeling a complex mixture of emotions, gratitude for the progress we'd made, lingering sadness for what had been lost, hope for what might still be rebuilt. Alone again, I walked the property slowly, touching the rough bark of trees Dad had protected, listening to the birds he had taught me to identify by song alone. At the edge of the meadow, I found the first shooting stars of the season, delicate pink flowers nodding in the breeze, exactly where they bloomed every spring. Dad had shown me these flowers when I was barely 7 years old, explaining how they returned to the same spots year after year, their seeds lying dormant through winter's harshest cold before emerging again in spring's warmth. Nature knows how to wait, he had told me, his large hand gentle around my small one as we crouched to examine the blossoms. It knows that after every winter, no matter how long or cold, spring always returns. Standing there now, 25 years later, I understood his lesson in a new way. Some things couldn't be rushed. Not healing, not reconciliation, not the slow rebuilding of trust between a brother and sister who had lost their way. But with patience, with care, with steady tending to what mattered, renewal was always possible. I gathered a small bouquet of the shooting stars, carried them back to the house, and placed them in a simple glass vase on Dad's desk. Now my desk, where I worked and dreamed and planned for the future of this place he had entrusted to me. On the wall above hung the framed agreement between Arthur, Ramsay, and Joseph Eagle Feather, no longer hidden in an attic trunk, but displayed proudly as the foundation of a new chapter in the lake house's history. Beside it, I had placed a photograph of Dad on the dock, his face weathered but content, the mountains rising behind him against a summer sky. This was his true legacy, not just the physical property, but the values it represented. Care for the land, respect for history, the courage to make amends, the wisdom to protect what was precious, not for personal gain, but for all who would come after. Outside, the lake rippled silver in the afternoon light, constant yet ever-changing, just as it had for countless generations before us, and would for countless more to come. In its patient rhythms, I found comfort, a reminder that some things endured beyond human disputes, beyond grief, beyond time itself. The house was quiet, but not silent. It creaked and settled, breathed with the wind, held memories in every board and beam. Dad's presence remained, not as a ghost, but as a foundation, a guiding principle, a story woven into the very fabric of the place. It wasn't just my sanctuary anymore. It had become something larger, a trust, a promise, a bridge between past and future. The battle for ownership had transformed into a shared commitment to stewardship, expanding the circle of those who cared for this small piece of Montana wilderness. As evening approached, I took Dad's old canoe out onto the water, paddling gently across the bay as stars began to appear overhead. The mountains reflected perfectly in the still surface, creating the illusion that I was floating in infinite space, suspended between two worlds. This was home, not just the physical structure on the shore, but this moment, this connection, this profound sense of belonging to something larger than myself, the understanding that we are all, in the end, just passing through, temporary caretakers of places that existed long before us and would continue, long after we were gone. Dad had known this truth. He had lived by it. And now, after conflict and loss and painful growth, so did I. The lake house stood waiting on the shore, windows glowing with warm light against the gathering darkness. Not just a house, but a legacy. Not just a legacy, but a promise. Not just a promise, but a future, unfolding one season at a time. I turned the canoe toward home at peace at last.